The Nile is the longest river in Africa and the disputed longest river in the world. Its incredible length spans from 11 countries from Egypt all the way to Tanzania. Now, we are aware of its length and size, but in the early 19th century to European explorers, the Nile was a mysterious and fabled river that promised adventure and riches if one were to discover its source. What followed were several exploration voyages deep into Africa. These voyages are fruitful ground for great tales already, but what is more, most of them were curiously intertwined. Welcome to Project Africa, a collaboration with some fantastic history YouTube channels. Definitely check out the playlist after watching this video. During the late 1830s, explorers embarked on a quest for a legendary goal, to discover the source of the Nile. The Ottoman governor at the time, Muhammed Ali of Egypt, had already launched 2 expeditions in those years in order to seek economic relations and expansion into Sudan. These expeditions proved fruitful. The navigable head of the Nile was found at a place called Gondokoro. It now was just the rapids to Gondokoro south that stood between adventurers and the source of the Nile. Considering the time frame, unfortunately, many adventurers and traders that moved south were no more than ordinary bandits raiding the African lands for their wealth, resources, and slaves. Regardless of the moral concerns and considerations, these marauders did contribute to the geographical knowledge of the region, as they often navigated through uncharted lands. In the 1840s, it were missionaries that worked inland from Mombasa that changed the course of exploration of the Nile. Whenever a caravan of Arab traders would pass by, Ludwig Krapf, Johann Redman, and Johann Erhard would ask for information about the places they had traveled. According to these traders, there were great lakes and huge mountains. When Krapf and Redman traveled into the direction several months later, they are said to have seen the mountains for themselves, covered in snow. These weren't just generic mountains, but turned out to be Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. These mountains could very well have given rise to the White Nile, one of the 2 main tributaries of the Nile. The men were awarded a medal by the Paris Geographical Society and, in contrast, severely ridiculed by the British. There was a bit of disparity between the 2 nations. Nevertheless, the fact that they had seen the mountains gave other explorers the idea to attempt and approach the source of the Nile from Africa's east coast. Building forth on the discoveries of the missionaries would eventually, and perhaps ironically, be done by 2 Englishmen, having both served in British India. Richard Burton was the enthusiastic traveller and renowned Oriental scholar of the 2. He was difficult at times, though, a typical man that, in Speke's words, was one of those men who can never be wrong. He had travelled to Mecca, an incredibly journey, certainly at the time, and had been invited by the British Royal Geographical Society to lead an expedition towards the source of the Nile. As for the other man, his name was John Hanning Speke, a big game hunting enthusiast. To be fair, finding the source of the Nile wasn't high on his list of priorities. He was a bit of a contrast to Burton, reserved, aloof, and not too interested in any of the scholarly work Burton wanted to do. Nevertheless, these men would become dependent on each other in the near future. They had met each other a few years before in Aden, Yemen, and now too Speke accompanied Burton on his exploration. As you can see on this painting, Burton had a rather prominent scar on his cheek. It's also on the book next to me. As a matter of fact, Speke had been there while Burton was wounded several years before. They had been on an expedition when a band of Somali bandits raided their camp. That seems like enough history between the 2 to be entrusted to each other on an exploration towards the source of the Nile through the African lands. The 2 men now set up their travels, following the instructions written down by the aforementioned missionaries, especially using the map on which Erhard drew a large inland sea. This sea would eventually turn out to be Lake Victoria, Lake Albert, and Lake Tanganyika. The men started their expedition in Zanzibar, a place known for its ivory and slave traders and its colorful collection of groups from all over the world: Africans, Arabs, Indians, and Europeans. Burton and Speke recruited African porters to whom thanks is owed for enabling these expeditions. Because of the tsetse fly being prevalent in the region, it was impossible to find a substitute for ensuring the supplying of expeditions. Loyal captains and headmen that spoke Swahili and stood in contact with local chiefs were a priceless addition to these expeditions. On June 16, 1857, they set off from Bagamoyo without as much as a clue if they were going to find the lakes and sources they were looking for. At first they went looking for the inland sea, after which they could start looking for the mountains and perhaps find one of the two tributaries of the Nile. Travels throughout Africa at the time weren't safe, to say the least. It didn't take long for Burton and Speke to become extremely ill with a depleted supply. Both suffered severe infections. Burton's legs became paralyzed and Speke became near blind and deaf. He lost sight due to ophthalmia, an aggressive infection, and gone deaf from a beetle penetrating his ear. Disregarding their condition, the men somehow made it to Lake Tanganyika and were unable to find a way across the lake, and considering their condition, they had to return, not knowing whether the supposed stream running out of the lake was the Nile. It wouldn't be for another 15 years that Livingstone and Stanley confirmed it was an inflowing stream named Ruzizi. We'll get to that in a bit. Once Speke and Burton returned to Tabora, Speke decided to visit the lake to the north, of which Arab traders had told him. Once he reached the lake, he instantly claimed that this lake, named Victoria after the British Queen, was the source of the Nile. It was a guess he really couldn't have known, and it would not be confirmed for several years afterwards. But upon his return, Burton snubbed him. Speke recounted. He wasn't amused. Speke claimed he found the source of the Nile. What ensued was a famous public quarrel between Burton and Speke, mainly about whether Lake Tanganyika or Victoria was the source of the Nile. The quarrel would get extremely ugly and very public. Aside from their fabled search for the source of the Nile, Burton and Speke too proved a fruitful source for British tabloids. It was evident that another expedition in search of the source of the Nile was required. As the argument between Speke and Burton developed, it became evident that the only way to solve it was by more exploration, figure out what the real source of the Nile was. In 1860, Speke returned to Africa, now accompanied by the Scotsman James August Grant. Grant was the complete opposite of Burton. He had an unwavering sense of loyalty to Speke. The two men once again traveled via Zanzibar to Lake Victoria. Then they made their way up north on the western side, entering Buganda and becoming the first Europeans to visit the Bantu kingdom under Mutesa I. It was there Speke fell in love with a girl given to him by the Queen Mother. For 5 months, Speke remained at court. He truly fell in love with the girl, Mary. The love was unreturned though, and those months spent at the court were described as very sad and tormenting. The king would not let him leave, and Speke spent ages trying to convince him to do so. But once he was allowed by Mutesa, he was able to make a quick dash, reunited with Grant, and explore the northern end of the lake. Here he discovered the Nile flowing over in what he coined the Ripon Falls. The men decided to follow the Nile downstream, entering Bunyoro. Within another 4 months, their supplies were low to the degree that they had to abandon their trail and move towards Gondokoro again. They hoped they could restock and find boats there to sail towards Khartoum. But here, another curious coincidence found the men. They met their old friend, a man named Samuel Baker, and his wife, Florence von Sass. They too had been on an adventure in an attempt to find the source of the Nile. The Bakers happened by chance to be in Gondokoro when they ran into Speke and Grant. Their story is a rather unusual one. Samuel White Baker, an Englishman, was a very affluent sportsman who had lived all over the world and had a passion for big game hunting, just like Speke. Having resided in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon for several years, on his return to England, his wife passed away. The couple had 4 daughters, which Samuel now left with his sister while he went hunting in the Balkans. Over there, one day, he stumbled upon an Ottoman slave auction of Hungarians. On impulse, he bought a 20 years younger girl who would become his wife, Florence. His affection was returned, and together they truly made a name for themselves thanks to their voyages. Now, Samuel later wrote that to Florence he owed his success and life. They traveled to Africa in April 1861 in search for the fabled source of the Nile, starting much farther north than Baker, Speke and Grant. They went from Cairo to Korosko, upon which they mounted camels through the Nubian desert. All the while the Bakers learned Arabic, mapped and studied the rivers and hills they encountered, and even made multiple visits to local chiefs. Around a year and a half after they embarked on their journey, they arrived in Khartoum. It was there they were planning on beginning their real expedition, follow the main course of the White Nile. It didn't take long for them to arrive at Gondokoro, and they ran into Speke and Grant. Speke enthusiastically told them about Lake Victoria he had discovered, most certainly the source of the Nile. Baker is said to have lamented, "Does not one leaf of the laurel remain for me?" Speke thereupon told him of the lake to the west, and while it wasn't the main source, as that was Lake Victoria, he said it probably was part of the Nile system. Speke gave the Bakers instructions and a map. It wasn't their original expedition, but the Bakers confidently embarked on their new adventure. The lake they were going to discover was Lake Albert, no more than 290 kilometers in a straight line from Gondokoro. A considerable journey through the desert, however. Unfortunately for the Bakers, there were several obstacles that made the journey even more difficult. To begin with, their porters mutinied, after which Florence managed to get them back in line. Their horses died, which meant they now had to mount oxen, and both Samuel and Florence fell very ill with fever. On March 4th, 1864, nearly 3 years after they started their journey from Cairo, they reached the lake. Samuel Baker called the lake the Albert Nyanza, Nyanza being the Swahili word for lake. They now took a boat to explore the lake, sailing past its eastern shore. When they reached the northern shore, they saw a river flowing into the lake. They rightly assumed it was the Nile, which they had already once crossed on their travels towards the lake. It was Florence's request they make sure it was, in fact, the Nile. They now sailed upstream, but had to halt their journey because of the great falls Baker decided to name Murchison. To this day, these falls remain a national park and tourist resort in Uganda. Eventually, the Bakers made their way to Gondokoro, and eventually, in the summer of 1865, arrived in Cairo. 2 large sources of the Nile had been explored, yet the Bakers left a stretch of the Nile between Lake Victoria and Albert unexplored, and there wasn't any certainty about the size of Lake Albert either. While the Bakers were exploring Lake Albert, Speke, Grant, and Speke's faithfuls, the 18 porters that had been with them since Zanzibar, turned home. Speke's message for London was, "The Nile is settled." It wasn't, to be fair. Speke's account had many omissions in it, not to mention the fact that he was the only one that had seen Lake Victoria. Burton wouldn't just let it slip and continued his public attacks. The men would never put aside their differences until their deaths. Speke would die soon in a very ironic tale. He was scheduled to have a debate with Burton in the Association for the Advancement of Science, but one day before the debate, he shot himself during a hunting trip. Considering the point of entry, his armpit, it is doubtful it was a suicide, but Burton nevertheless used the occasion to spread myths that Speke was too afraid to debate him and took his own life. Nasty business indeed. Another speaker at the event was David Livingstone, and it was he that would undertake the next expedition in an attempt to locate the real source of the Nile. The famed British explorer Dr. David Livingstone, together with his close friend Sir Roderick Murchison, decided to find and map out all sources of the Nile. Both the men figured Lake Tanganyika was probably the origin. They left in 1867, and as the map shows, the route they took passed the Rovuma River all the way north to Lake Tanganyika. Livingstone didn't bring a lot of supplies, but then again, the famed British traveller wouldn't need a lot, as he wouldn't be away for too long, it was thought. Ironically, this journey took Livingstone 6 years, and in fact, would be his last one. Livingstone drifted during those years, travelling with Arab caravans around Ujiji, which was their trading hub. Misfortune befell him, his porters mutinied, supplies ran out, he lost his communication line with Zanzibar, and was very sick most of the time. It wasn't until late 1871 when a new traveller arrived in Ujiji. His name was Henry Stanley, and he started his journey from Zanzibar, sent to Africa by the New York Herald to find Dr. Livingstone. When he arrived, he found an old and exhausted man. The meeting between the men became famous for Stanley explaining that he was too embarrassed to embrace him, uttering the famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." In Stanley's company, Livingstone re-energized, and together they rode to the northern end of Lake Tanganyika. There, they discovered the Ruzizi could not be connected with the Nile as it flowed into the lake. Subsequently, Livingstone became convinced the Lualaba River was the headwater of the Nile. In truth, it was the Congo. Stanley advised Livingstone to return to England in order to recuperate, but Livingstone adamantly refused. He wanted to find the Nile fountains, and it became his last attempt. He passed away in May 1873 on the shore of Lake Bangweulu, suffering from malaria and dysentery. His heart and internal organs were buried by Chuma Nsusi, the captain and headman of his expedition party. The tree they were buried under were marked with his name and date, upon which his body and journals were carried to the coast, a 2-month journey to be returned to England. His remains received a hero's welcome. It eventually was Henry Morton Stanley who discovered the missing pieces of the puzzle. He learned of Livingstone's death in 1873 and decided to continue Livingstone's research on both the Congo and Nile River systems, using the findings of Speke, Burton and Baker. A gigantic project that turned out to be very worthwhile. In November 1874, Stanley led a caravan of over 350 men into Africa. They traversed past Lake Victoria and visited the Kingdom of Buganda. They took the boat, the Lady Alice, named after Stanley's fiancée, and explored the lake. It turned out Speke had been right about the size and importance. Crimes against the local population were committed, which Stanley was severely criticized for later in life. And his fiancée, after whom the boat was named, decided to marry someone else in his absence. It was a troubled legacy. With the aid of canoes, Stanley explored the Lake Tanganyika and confirmed there was no connection with the Nile. He did the same with the Lualaba and the Nyangwe. He proved the Lualaba was in fact the Congo and not an early stage of the Nile. Following its stream, he faced the Stanley Falls, which the men had to pass, and it did take considerable time. By the time they passed the falls, they had had 24 battles with natives. What the group didn't know was that there were still 8 battles waiting for them for the rest of the trip. At the Livingstone Falls, Stanley's last European companion, Frank Pocock, drowned. The Lady Alice was left to rot. And when they were eventually able to send a message for help after months of hardship, of the 350 original men, only 114 were left. After exactly 999 days on August 1877, the men reached a Portuguese outpost and were rescued. Henry Morton Stanley had, however, proven that there was no connection between the Nile and the rivers to the south. And that's a remarkable story of several expeditions that were all curiously intertwined about discovering the source of the Nile. Although the first expedition started amidst the 18th century, it took well over 15 years to finally conclusively determine the sources of the Nile. This video was part of Project Africa, and if you want to know more about, for example, Liberia, check out Gipoli's video before me. If the life of Menelik II sounds interesting, check out the witty and well-edited video by Jack Rackham. Both videos are linked in the description, as is the playlist for the entire Project Africa collaboration. Thank you for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, considering visiting my Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.